When we talk about inventions that changed the world, we usually imagine great machines, famous names, moments of brilliance lit up in textbooks. The printing press, the steam engine, electricity, these are the stars of history. But for every celebrated breakthrough, there are quieter ones, almost invisible, that shaped our lives just as deeply. They slipped into the background, transforming daily existence without fanfare, and over time, their names faded until hardly anyone remembered them at all. These are the inventions that worked in silence. The glass lenses that changed how we see, the mills that turned rivers into engines, the locks and keys that protected what mattered most. They were not glamorous, but without them, our cities, our science, even our sleep would look very different today. Tonight, we will wander slowly through those forgotten stories. We will see how ordinary objects carried extraordinary power, how the simplest ideas quietly rearranged the world. This is not the history of genius alone, but of tools, devices, and clever solutions that touched every corner of human life. Welcome to Boring History for Sleep. If you'd like to drift again through history's hidden stories, don't forget to gently tap like and subscribe, so the next time you're ready to rest with the past, these calm journeys will be waiting. Now, settle in, close your eyes if you wish, and let us begin with the first of these forgotten inventions. An idea so simple it feels obvious, yet so powerful it reshaped the way people measured their days. Time surrounds us today in glowing numbers, on our phones, our computers, our walls, even on our wrists. We glance at it without thinking, but it was not always so simple. For most of human history, time was not a matter of minutes or seconds. It was the rhythm of the sun rising and setting, the seasons turning, the church bell ringing across a village. Exact hours were luxuries, and the tools to measure them were far from ordinary. Among the quietest, most forgotten inventions are the ones that tried to tame time itself. Long before ticking clocks and chiming watches, there were water clocks, sand glasses, and even candles carefully marked to burn at steady rates. These objects do not gleam in the grand halls of invention, but they change daily life in ways that echo even now. Tonight, let us walk through their story. Imagine first the water clock. Known in ancient worlds from China to Egypt to Greece, it worked with a simple principle: a container filling or emptying drop by drop, measuring the passing of time not by gears, but by the steady flow of water. These clepsydrae, as the Greeks called them, could be used in courts to limit how long someone could speak, or in workshops to time tasks. They whispered the hours, not in bells or numbers, but in ripples and drips. Unlike sundials, they worked at night. Unlike stars, they could be carried indoors. They made time portable. But they had flaws. Water thickened in cold weather, evaporated in heat, flowed unpredictably depending on the vessel's shape. So people sought new ways. One of the strangest and most fascinating was the candle clock. At first glance, it looked like any candle, but it was carefully measured, marked along its length. As it burned down, each mark showed the passing of time. Some even had weights hidden inside, so that as the wax melted, the weights would fall with a sound, a primitive alarm clock. Picture a medieval scholar bent over his books, the flickering candle not only giving him light, but silently measuring his night's labor. Then came the sand glass, or hourglass, the most iconic of all. Two bulbs of glass, joined by a narrow neck, with sand flowing steadily from one to the other. The principle was simple, the effect remarkable. Suddenly, time could be measured in equal portions, 15 minutes, 30, an hour. Sailors used them aboard ships to measure watches and navigation, turning the glass as regularly as the tide. Cooks used them in kitchens. Monks used them in prayer. And though they seem quaint now, hourglasses gave humanity something profound: the ability to divide time not by the sun or season, but by human need. What is most remarkable is not their mechanics, but the way they shaped life. In villages, bells still tolled the hours, but within homes, people began to live by smaller fragments of time. Work could be paced more evenly, games could be timed, even rest could be measured. In a sense, these silent inventions pulled time inward, away from the cosmos and into the palm of the hand. And yet, over centuries, they slipped into silence. As mechanical clocks appeared in town squares with gears and weights driving hands across dials, the old instruments seemed too humble. A sand glass became an ornament, a candle just a light, a water clock a curiosity in a scholar's cabinet. Their role diminished, but their impact remained. They had trained people to think of time as measurable, divisible, manageable. Without them, perhaps, the mechanical clock would have felt stranger, less natural. With them, it was a seamless transition. Consider how they changed the very idea of work. Before these inventions, a task was done when it was done. A meal took as long as it took. A walk lasted until the destination appeared. With sandglasses and candles, tasks could be timed, efficiency measured, delays noticed. These were small steps toward the modern world where every second is counted. They did not look like revolutions, but they were. Even language remembers them. We still speak of burning the candle at both ends, a phrase born of candle clocks. We speak of the sands of time, imagining grains slipping away. These phrases are fossils of forgotten technology, reminders of objects once central to daily life. There is also a certain poetry in them. A sand glass cannot be paused. Once turned, it flows until it is done. A candle cannot be hurried. It burns at its pace, regardless of our impatience. In their silence, they taught patience, rhythm, acceptance. Perhaps that is why they endure as symbols even now, on desks and in art, long after they cease to be practical tools. Think of a sailor in the 15th century steering a ship across unknown waters, glancing at the hourglass to know when to turn, when to rest. Think of a monk in a stone monastery, chanting prayers timed not only by bells, but by sand slipping grain by grain. Think of a judge in ancient Athens watching water drip as an orator spoke, waiting for the last drop to fall. In each case, the invention was more than a tool. It was a guardian of fairness, of order, of rhythm. And that is perhaps their greatest gift. They gave structure where none existed, discipline where life was once only instinct. They are forgotten, yes. Few can name the inventors of candle clocks or the exact origins of sandglasses, but their legacy is everywhere, hidden in the way we glance at our phones, check our watches, live by hours and minutes. They were the first step into the world of measured life. Tonight, as you imagine these tools, picture them not as relics, but as living things. The slow drip of water, the soft glow of a candle, the steady fall of sand. They're history's lullabies, silent companions that carried humanity through the dark before the ticking clock. Forgotten, perhaps, but never truly gone.
When we imagine inventions that changed history,
We think of locomotives hissing with steam, factories pounding with machines, or the flash of electricity lighting a city skyline. But civilization was not built only on noise and spectacle. It was built, too, on quieter inventions. Tools so small, so ordinary, that we have forgotten they were ever invented at all. The match, the lock and key, the lens of a pair of spectacles, each belongs not to the age of great engineers, but to the patient tinkering of craftsmen. They came without parades, without fireworks, without revolutions shouted in the streets. Yet they reshaped human life as surely as any steam engine or telegraph. These are the silent inventions, humble guardians of warmth, security, and vision, that altered the course of history while leaving scarcely a trace of themselves in memory. The fire at your fingertips, matches. For most of human history, fire was not a given. It was a prize. Households guarded embers through the night, carrying them in clay pots or ash to preserve the spark until morning. To lose fire was a crisis, forcing long, tedious rituals of striking flint against steel or borrowing flame from a neighbor. It is hard today to imagine how fragile warmth once was. Enter the match, a small stick tipped with chemicals that could produce fire instantly with a single stroke. In China, as early as the 6th century, people used primitive sulfur matches, wooden splints dipped in chemicals that ignited when touched by flame. But it was in 19th century Europe that the modern friction match appeared. John Walker, an English chemist, created the first practical match in 1826, though he never patented it. His invention was crude, a wooden stick tipped with a paste of chemicals that burst into flame when scraped against sandpaper. Yet it worked, and suddenly fire was portable, immediate, democratic. The cultural shift was immense. Meals could be cooked at a whim, not after a laborious process of sparking and blowing. Lamps could be lit instantly at dusk, no longer dependent on smoldering wicks. Travelers could carry warmth in their pockets. Even armies felt the change. Soldiers no longer wasted time coaxing sparks into tinder. They lit their fires with ease. And yet, despite its transformative impact, the match has slipped into obscurity as an invention. No monuments honor Walker or the many who refined his idea. The match is too ordinary, too everyday. Its very success doomed it to invisibility. That is the paradox of silent inventions. They become so natural, we forget they were ever invented at all. The guardian of property, locks and keys. If fire was survival, security was dignity. In the ancient world, to own something was not enough. You had to defend it. Without locks, possessions were guarded by walls, weapons, or trust. Privacy was rare, and safety fragile. The lock changed that. Archaeologists have uncovered wooden pin tumbler locks in Mesopotamia, dating back more than 4,000 years. They worked by raising pins to a certain height, released only by a specially carved key. The Romans refined them into metal, creating intricate wards that required precision to open. A Roman merchant might wear his small bronze key as a ring, carrying his security with him. In medieval Europe, locksmiths became artists as well as engineers, forging iron locks that were both practical and ornate. Some were so complex they doubled as puzzles, designed not only to secure but to impress. The presence of a lock on a chest or a door was more than protection. It was a statement: this belongs to me. The effect on society was profound. Locks made absence possible. A merchant could leave his stall. A family could travel, knowing their possessions were secure. Trust in locks allowed trade to flourish, homes to grow, cities to function. Without them, Every possession would need constant guarding. Every street a potential battlefield of theft. Locks gave peace of mind, and with peace came progress. And yet, like matches, locks are seldom celebrated. We turn a key every day without thinking of its history. But imagine life without it. Every journey shadowed by fear, every home vulnerable, every possession temporary. The lock is not just a device. It is the foundation of privacy itself. The window to knowledge, spectacles. Among all forgotten inventions, none altered human life so quietly and so profoundly as the lens. A simple curve of glass, bending light, became the key to sight, science, and discovery. Spectacles appeared in Italy in the late 13th century. Their origin is shrouded in mystery. No one knows the name of the first craftsman who joined two lenses in a frame, but their effect was immediate. For the first time, age was no barrier to reading or writing. Monks who had copied manuscripts for decades could continue into old age. Merchants could tally accounts without error. Scholars could peer at texts with clarity. Knowledge ceased to be limited by the failing human eye. From these humble spectacles came greater tools. The telescope turning sight to the heavens, the microscope turning it inward to the smallest worlds. Galileo would not have seen Jupiter's moons without lenses. Leeuwenhoek would not have discovered bacteria. The entire scientific revolution, the unfolding of modern medicine, astronomy, and biology, all depended on the first craftsman who shaped glass to help an aging reader. And yet, his name is lost. No monument marks his workshop. Spectacles are so common, so natural, that we forget they were ever invented. But they are not only instruments of clarity, they are instruments of continuity, extending human life not in years, but in usefulness. A society with spectacles is a society where knowledge does not vanish when eyes grow dim. That is power beyond measure. Ink and pen, the tools of memory. To write is to resist forgetting. But ink, like fire, was once fragile. Early inks, made of soot or plant dyes, faded with time. Papyrus crumbled, parchments cracked. To record thoughts required a technology of both permanence and ease. By the Middle Ages, the refinement of iron gall ink changed everything. Made from tannins in oak galls, iron salts, and gum, it created a rich, dark script that bonded with parchment. Letters written in it could last centuries. Coupled with quill pens, goose feathers sharpened into nibs, it allowed the steady copying of texts, the keeping of records, the writing of contracts. Knowledge could travel across generations. The invention of durable ink and reliable pens may seem minor compared to printing presses or telegraphs, but without them, history itself would be emptier. Every law, every poem, every map was once a wet line of ink drying on a page. To invent ink was to invent memory. The balance of trust. Scales. Commerce, too, required its silent tools. The scale, two pans suspended from a beam, balanced by weights, emerged in ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia. It was not only a tool of trade, but of justice, symbolizing fairness. Without accurate measures, markets would collapse into suspicion and chaos. Over centuries, scales grew more precise. Counterweights became standardized. Merchants held accountable. Trust in measures allowed strangers to trade with confidence. A farmer could carry grain to a city, knowing he would be paid fairly. A goldsmith could weigh coins, ensuring purity. A physician could measure herbs for remedies. Scales made honesty visible. Like locks, they are invisible today. We weigh fruit at the market, letters at the post office, without considering the history beneath the act.
but the scale was a revolution of trust. Without it, markets would be barter and guesswork, a world of endless dispute. Windows of light, glass panes. Even something as simple as glass windows reshaped human life. Before their spread, homes were dark, their openings shuttered or covered in cloth or horn. Glass panes, first used in Roman villas and spreading in the Middle Ages, allowed light without wind, vision without exposure. Imagine the change. A family could see the sky from indoors, watch the street while remaining sheltered. Work could continue by daylight without drafts or rain. Cities became brighter, homes more private, lives more comfortable. Today, a window is an afterthought. When we picture revolutions, we imagine the clash of armies, the thunder of cannons, or the roar of engines. But there are quieter revolutions too. Revolutions not of violence or machinery, but of ink and paper, of fragile materials that changed how human beings remember, communicate, and dream. The invention of paper, the refinement of ink, the creation of movable type, the authority of seals and stamps, these were not grand spectacles. They were humble tools, often born in workshops and monasteries, carried in merchants' packs and scholars' satchels. Yet their impact was immense. Without them, knowledge would remain fragile, voices would fade, history itself would scatter like smoke. With them, the world was given permanence. Words could last, travel, multiply, and speak across centuries. And yet, as with matches or locks, we forget they were ever invented at all. We take for granted that a page is always there to be written upon, that books are always waiting to be read. But this was not always so. Imagine a time before paper. Knowledge had to be carved into clay tablets, heavy and brittle, or scratched onto wax, which melted in heat and was endlessly reused. Parchment, made from animal skin, was more durable but costly and scarce. Only the wealthiest institutions could afford to keep large collections of texts. A single book might represent months of work by scribes and the sacrifice of many animals. Knowledge existed, but it was slow, expensive, and precious. Then came paper. First crafted in China during the Han Dynasty around the 2nd century BCE, slowly spreading along trade routes to the Islamic world, and finally reaching Europe by the Middle Ages. It was thin, light, flexible, and far cheaper to produce than parchment. Suddenly, writing was no longer bound by scarcity. It could expand, multiply, circulate. In monasteries, paper allowed the copying of texts not just for kings and nobles, but for libraries, towns, and eventually individuals. It was like giving the world a second memory. Fragile, perhaps, but vastly more abundant. With paper came ink, that silent river of memory. Early inks were simple, soot mixed with water, plant dyes pressed into paste, but they faded, smudged, washed away. The refinement of iron gall ink in medieval Europe changed that. Made from oak galls, iron salts, and gum, it produced a dark, permanent script that sank into fibers. Documents written in it could endure centuries. The ink of contracts, letters, poems, and chronicles became as enduring as stone, but with the intimacy of handwriting. A king's decree could travel across a kingdom and be trusted across oceans. A scholar's notes could be preserved for generations. A love letter could survive to be read by descendants. Ink gave permanence to the fragile breath of words. But paper and ink alone would not have transformed the world without the means to multiply them. For centuries, knowledge grew slowly because it had to be copied by hand. Monks bent over desks in candlelight, painstakingly tracing each letter of scripture, each line of law. Books existed, but they were treasures, too rare for ordinary people to touch. Then came in the 15th century, in Mainz, Germany, Johannes Gutenberg combined several known techniques, movable metal type, oil-based ink, and the screw press, to create something extraordinary, the printing press. In one stroke, the pace of knowledge multiplied beyond measure. What once took months could be done in days. Identical copies could be produced, spreading ideas with unprecedented speed. The Reformation, the Renaissance, the scientific revolution all depended upon this quiet invention. Without it, discoveries would have remained whispers. With it, they became thunder. Yet the press itself was built upon forgotten tools, the patient grinding of lenses for spectacles that allowed printers to see clearly, the recipes of ink refined by unknown craftsmen, the thin fibers of paper carried across continents. Even more modest was the seal, the simple wax imprint pressed by a ring or a stamp. To us it may seem decorative, but to the people of earlier centuries it was authority itself. A seal on a document meant authenticity. It guaranteed that the words inside belonged to the king, the bishop, the guild. It was a lock for information, as powerful in its way as iron keys on doors. Without seals, forgery would flourish, trust in documents would falter, and trade, law, and governance would weaken. Every wax seal carried weight. A merchant in Venice could sign a contract with a partner in Bruges, sealed with his emblem, and trust that agreement across oceans. A royal decree, sealed in wax, could command armies or reshape laws. It was a small, silent invention, yet it held entire societies together through trust. What unites these inventions, paper, ink, printing, seals, is not only their practicality, but their silence. They are not celebrated in parades, but without them, our world would collapse. Imagine, even now, if paper had never been invented. Every record would exist only in stone or memory. Libraries would be vaults of leather and skin, few and fragile. Imagine if printing had never spread. Ideas would trickle, not flow. Revolutions of thought, from Copernicus to Newton, might never have left the desks of their authors. Imagine if ink faded within years, if words vanished with each season. History itself would be a rumor. And yet, because these inventions succeeded, they vanished from memory. We do not praise the paper when we open a book, we praise the author. We do not think of the ink when we read a contract, we think of the law. We do not notice the seal when we look at a medieval decree, we notice the king's name. These tools, like invisible servants, shaped the world while erasing themselves from it. They became the background of history, the fabric upon which brighter events were painted. But they were not just technical. They changed how humans thought about themselves. To write on paper is to see thought externalized, to know that words can outlive the speaker. To print a book is to imagine not one audience, but thousands, people you will never meet, minds you will never see. To sign with a seal is to extend your presence beyond your body, to command trust at a distance. These inventions stretched human identity across space and time. They gave permanence to ideas, authority to words, and reach to the individual voice. So tonight, let us pause to remember them. Picture a scholar in Baghdad dipping his reed pen into black ink, filling a sheet of fresh paper with diagrams of stars. Picture a printer in Mainz pressing wet ink onto rag paper pages, lifting the sheet to see the sharp lines of a book for the first time. Picture a messenger carrying a wax-sealed letter across muddy roads, knowing the small emblem in red will speak louder than his voice. These are not the inventions we celebrate, but they are the inventions that carried us here. They are forgotten, yes, but forgotten does not mean unimportant. Forgotten means successful, absorbed into life so completely that we no longer notice. And that, perhaps, is their greatest triumph, to change the world without demanding glory, to whisper through centuries while others shout, to hold together the fragile threads of memory, law, and knowledge in silence.
History is often told through empires, battles, and discoveries. But beneath every great story runs a quieter one, the story of how people moved. The journeys of merchants and farmers, soldiers and families, pilgrims and travelers, all depended on inventions so ordinary we rarely think of them at all. Wheels turning on axles, wooden carts creaking along dusty roads, ferries drifting across rivers, bridges rising against rushing waters. These were not marvels of science nor spectacles of steel, but they made civilization possible. Without them, cities would remain isolated islands, and knowledge, goods, and ideas would never flow. Yet, like matches or paper, these tools are largely forgotten, absorbed into the background of daily life until their absence is unimaginable. The wheel itself is one of humanity's oldest and simplest inventions, and yet its quiet genius reshaped everything. Archaeologists trace its origins to Mesopotamia, more than 5,000 years ago, when simple wooden discs, mounted on axles, began to roll. At first, wheels were used not for transport, but for pottery, spinning clay into shape. Only later were they attached to carts, pulled by animals, to carry loads across land. This shift from carrying by hand to dragging on sleds and then to rolling on wheels transformed labor. A farmer could move 10 times more grain. A merchant could bring goods to distant markets. A family could travel further, faster, with less exhaustion. Yet who invented the wheel? No single name survives. It is a tool so obvious, so fundamental, that it feels less like invention than discovery, though it was crafted by human hands. Over centuries, the wheel grew stronger, reinforced with bronze, iron, then steel, evolving into spoked designs that lightened loads and quickened speeds. The humble cart became the ancestor of caravans, wagons, and carriages, vehicles that carried the world forward long before trains and cars. But wheels alone could not conquer rivers. For that, people turned to ferries. Imagine a small village divided by a wide stream. Without boats, its people were cut off from trade, from neighbors, from markets on the far shore. Early ferries were little more than rafts, planks bound together, pushed along with poles or guided by ropes strung from bank to bank. Over time, they grew more sophisticated. Chain ferries used cables to stabilize their passage, ensuring safety even across swift currents. Horse ferries mounted animals on treadmills, their hooves powering paddle wheels to push the boat forward. These contraptions, forgotten now, were lifelines of medieval and early modern communities. Long before stone bridges spanned great rivers, ferries carried people, animals, carts, and news across the waters. For many, the ferry was not just a vessel, but a ritual. Market days began with queues of wagons waiting their turn. Journeys ended with ferrymen guiding travelers through fog and rain. Ferries were stories in motion, small but vital threads in the fabric of travel. And then there were bridges, perhaps the most symbolic of all transport inventions, for they did not merely carry people, but conquered obstacles. To span a river was to join two worlds. The earliest bridges were simple, logs laid across streams, stones balanced to form stepping paths. But soon came rope bridges, woven from vines in mountain regions, swaying over gorges. Then with civilizations like Rome came arches of stone, rising in strength and beauty. The Romans built bridges that endured centuries, their stones locked together in precise geometry, some still standing today. Medieval engineers followed with drawbridges, lifting to defend castles while still allowing trade and travel. Later, timber trusses and suspension designs expanded possibilities, paving the way for the iron and steel giants of the industrial age. Yet beneath every massive modern span lies the legacy of forgotten carpenters, masons, and villagers who built humbler crossings.
Without them, towns would have remained divided, and the roads of history would have ended at the water's edge. What makes these inventions so fascinating is not just their mechanics, but their cultural impact. Wheels, ferries, and bridges did not only move goods, they moved ideas. A cart rolling into a market carried not only grain or cloth, but news of distant lands. A ferry across a river brought dialects, songs, and stories, mingling cultures that might otherwise remain apart. A bridge between two towns was also a bridge between ways of life. Every journey was not just transport, but transformation, shaping the world silently, without fanfare. And yet they, too, slipped into invisibility. We step into cars and cross bridges today without a thought for their ancestors. The ferry has become a quaint curiosity, the horse-powered treadmill boat a forgotten relic. The wheel is so omnipresent it is almost invisible, a circle we no longer marvel at. But once, each was a revelation. Each expanded horizons, stretched distances, made the world larger and yet more connected. Without them, the flow of history itself would have stalled. So let us remember them tonight, not as relics, but as companions. Picture a Mesopotamian farmer rolling his cart across a dirt track, the squeal of wood on wood as his oxen pull. Picture a medieval ferryman guiding a raft laden with villagers and sheep, mist curling over the water. Picture a Roman engineer laying the final stone of an arch, knowing it will stand longer than his own life. These are the inventions we celebrate, but they are the ones that carried us here. Wheels beneath us, ferries across, bridges over. They are the silent roads of history, forgotten, but never truly gone.
When we imagine invention, we often think of spectacular machines or glittering technologies that transformed nations. But just as important, perhaps more so, are the quiet domestic tools that shaped everyday life. For centuries, comfort was not guaranteed. Warmth, coolness, air, and water had to be coaxed and tamed with ingenuity. Today, we assume these things are permanent. Our homes are heated in winter, cooled in summer, lit at will, supplied with water on command. But before electricity, before plumbing, before refrigeration, there was a long history of smaller inventions, fragile, practical, and ingenious, that gave families dignity and survival. These are the forgotten comforts of home, the little revolutions that slipped into daily life, altering it forever while leaving barely a whisper in the story of progress. Imagine first the struggle against heat. Summer has always pressed hard upon human life, especially in towns where air stagnated and walls trapped warmth. Long before electric fans, people devised their own methods of ventilation. In the Middle East, tall towers were built into houses, wind catchers they were called, slits facing prevailing breezes, drawing cool air down into rooms. In Europe, homes relied on open courtyards, shaded windows, and cross ventilation, placing doors opposite one another so air could move. Even in ordinary cottages, small inventions mattered. Shutters that could close against glare, awnings stretched from wooden frames, narrow slits in walls to direct air. They were not mechanical marvels, but they transformed unbearable afternoons into survivable ones. We forget them now because modern ventilation is hidden in wires and ducts, humming unseen. But for centuries, human comfort depended on nothing more than clever holes in walls and the movement of air. And then there was the opposite problem, cold. For much of history, the hearth was the center of the home, its flame both light and warmth, its smoke rising through primitive chimneys or holes in roofs. Yet even here, small inventions changed everything. The chimney itself was a revolution, channeling smoke away, allowing homes to have multiple floors without suffocating fumes. Grates, bellows, fire irons, tools for tending flames made heat more efficient. Later, tiled stoves in Europe radiated warmth for hours, transforming stone chambers into habitable spaces. None of these are celebrated in textbooks, yet without them, winter would have been unbearable, long nights defined by cold and smoke. Water, too, demanded its inventions. For most of history, it had to be carried by hand, hauled from rivers, springs, or wells. The invention of the well was simple in concept, but extraordinary in effect. A shaft dug into the earth, lined with stone or wood, reaching down to groundwater. It gave permanence to settlements, freeing families from endless journeys to streams. But the well alone was not enough. To draw water required buckets and ropes, and soon came pulleys, cranks, and windlasses. Each small refinement made the task less exhausting. In larger communities, animal-powered wheels drew water in bulk, filling cisterns for baths and fountains. By the Middle Ages, pumps appeared, pistons and levers lifting water against gravity, early cousins of the machines that would one day drive engines. These mechanisms, built into ordinary life, reshaped how people lived not with spectacle, but with persistence. Every sip, every wash, every pot boiled for supper, each was made possible by forgotten tools deep in the ground. Consider also the matter of keeping food fresh. Before refrigeration, preservation was an endless challenge. Salt and smoke, vinegar and drying, all were used to slow decay. But another quiet method was equally vital: ice and cold storage. In winter, lakes and ponds were cut with saws, great blocks of ice dragged into cellars lined with straw or sawdust. In some places, entire ice houses were built, stone chambers sunk into earth, domed to trap coolness. These icy vaults preserved meat, butter, fruit, and drink through the warmer months, long before anyone dreamed of an electric refrigerator. For wealthy families, it was luxury. For ordinary people, it was survival. In America, an entire industry grew in the 19th century, harvesting ice in winter and shipping it by rail and ship to distant cities. It seems quaint now, almost primitive, but it was a global network of cold carved from frozen rivers. Without these forgotten systems, summer would have been scarcity, and whole diets would have been impossible. In the home, countless other small devices shaped comfort. Oil lamps with carefully designed wicks and glass chimneys burned brighter and longer than open flames, making evening work and reading possible. Curtains, rugs, and shutters softened interiors, keeping out drafts or glare. Simple tools like butter churns, spinning wheels, and hand mills gave independence to households, reducing reliance on markets. The pulley and crank, repeated in countless forms, raising buckets, grinding grain, lifting heavy loads, were the hidden skeletons of daily life. Each was small, each was ordinary, but together they made survival not only possible, but bearable. It is worth remembering that none of these inventions had inventors who became famous. There was no single celebrated figure who created the first chimney, the first pulley, the first ice house. They were the work of many hands, across generations, refined slowly until they became invisible. Their very ordinariness is why they are forgotten. And yet, in their quiet way, they mattered more than almost anything else. A society with wells and pumps could grow into cities. A society with chimneys and stoves could endure harsh winters. A society with ice houses could plan, preserve, and expand diets. Civilization rests not only on great machines, but on these silent servants of the home. When we look back, we must imagine the rhythm of a day in those earlier centuries. A woman lowering a bucket into a dark shaft, hearing the splash and winding it back with a creaking crank. A ferryman guiding blocks of ice into a cellar, layering them with straw and sealing the door against the coming heat. A mason setting bricks for a chimney, knowing smoke would finally leave a house clean. A family opening shutters in the morning,
letting fresh air sweep through the room. Each act was simple. Together, they built lives of comfort where none had been. Today, we hardly notice them. We flick a switch and expect light, twist a tap and expect water, turn a dial and expect warmth or coolness. But behind each modern convenience lies a long chain of forgotten tools, inventions that came quietly, worked faithfully, and slipped into obscurity. They remind us that history is not only made in palaces or battlefields, but in kitchens and cellars, in wells and hearths, in the silent revolution of ordinary life. And perhaps in remembering them, we see our own lives differently. We recognize that comfort is not inevitable, but crafted, not natural, but invented. Every breath of cool air, every sip of water, every meal kept fresh is the legacy of forgotten hands, forgotten minds, and forgotten tools that once turned necessity into possibility. These are the comforts of home, silent and enduring, too humble to be celebrated, too vital to be lost.
History is a story of connection. From the moment human communities began to spread, they faced the same problem again and again. How to speak across distance, how to send words faster than footsteps, how to carry thought where the voice could not reach. Today, we solve it with a swipe of a finger, invisible signals leaping through the air. But long before telephones, long before radios, long before the internet, there were quieter systems, tools and tricks of sound and light, of ink and footsteps that carried news, warnings, promises, and dreams. They were fragile, imperfect, sometimes painfully slow, yet they held entire societies together. They are largely forgotten now, erased by speed and technology, but once they were as vital as breath. Imagine the tolling of a bell. In medieval villages, the bell was not only a religious instrument, but the heart of communication. It rang for time, for gathering, for alarm. A single strike in the morning might call workers to fields. A peal at noon might mark the pause for meals. Long, urgent tolls signaled fire or danger, summoning neighbors to buckets and axes. Each village had its own rhythm of bells, a language understood instinctively by its people. They were not mere sound, they were signals, coded messages in bronze. A traveler entering a new town might hear a pattern he did not know and struggle to understand. But for locals, the bells spoke with authority, telling them what words could not shout across fields. It was a technology of air, a simple invention that unified scattered lives into a single rhythm. Beyond the village, communication stretched along dusty roads in the form of couriers. The post, so natural today, was once a fragile invention. In Persia, the Achaemenid Empire built one of the first great postal systems, relay riders on horseback carrying sealed messages along well-kept roads. Herodotus described it. Neither snow nor rain nor heat nor darkness of night stays these couriers from their swift completion of their appointed course. Those words, later adopted by the United States Postal Service, reveal how ancient and enduring the dream of swift letters truly was. From Persia, it spread to Rome, where Cusus Publicus relays carried orders across the empire, moving faster than any soldier on foot. These systems required not only riders, but stations, inns, and fresh horses, a vast infrastructure invisible to most, but essential to power. Letters became arteries of empire, and without them, administration would have collapsed. Yet the names of the men who built these systems are lost. Only the letters themselves remain, fragments of lives passed hand to hand. In smaller communities, signals of light and fire bridged distance when riders could not. Beacon fires dotted coastlines and hilltops, raised in alarm to warn of invasion or danger.
A single spark could race across hundreds of miles, as each hill lit in turn, a chain of warning faster than any messenger. In China, beacon towers lined the Great Wall, carrying smoke by day and fire by night, summoning soldiers long before the enemy appeared. In Greece, flames on mountains warned of Persian fleets. These systems were fragile. Clouds could obscure smoke, rain could drown fire, but when they worked, they were as swift as lightning. To watch a fire leap from hill to hill was to see community itself in action. Each flame a word, each word a promise. Forgotten now, replaced by wires and satellites, they were once the difference between safety and destruction. Sound, too, was pressed into service. Across Africa, drums spoke over forests, each beat a syllable, each rhythm a phrase. Skilled drummers could send messages across miles, repeated by others until villages far apart understood. To outsiders, it sounded like music. To locals, it was conversation. Polynesian cultures used conch shells, their low moan rolling over water, calling boats to shore or warning of storms. Even in Europe, horns and trumpets served as signals not of art, but of command. A blast across a battlefield could mean advance, retreat, or rally. In all these places, sound became language, stripped of detail, but urgent in purpose. Then there were flags. In ports and on ships, colored cloths spoke when voices could not. Maritime signal flags, combinations of shapes and colors, told of disease, danger, distress. A single raised square of yellow might warn "plague aboard, keep away." Lines of flags strung across masts might spell letters, names, or instructions. On land, too, semaphore appeared. Men on hillsides with tall arms of wood or fabric angled into positions to represent letters. In France, the shop brothers created a vast network of semaphore towers during the 18th century, sending messages across the country in minutes rather than days. Operators watched through telescopes, adjusting their arms in patterns relayed from tower to tower. It was a mechanical internet of wood and rope, a marvel in its day, now nearly forgotten. All of these systems, the bells, the posts, the beacons, the drums, the flags, were fragile, limited, imperfect. Bells could not travel far, letters could be delayed or lost, smoke could be hidden by fog, drums misheard in the rain. Yet together they created a web of connection that bound humanity. They were the skeleton beneath the skin of history, unnoticed but essential. Without them, armies would not have marched in time, markets would not have thrived, cities would not have held together. Every contract signed, every warning sent, every greeting delivered depended on them. And they shaped thought itself. To live in a village where bells rang was to live by a shared clock. To rely on letters was to imagine absent friends as still present. To trust a beacon was to trust distant allies you could not see. Communication changed how people saw distance, not as empty space, but as something that could be crossed with signals and trust. Each system carried not only words, but relationships. Today, they are forgotten. The bell still rings, but mostly for nostalgia. The post arrives, but slower than email. Beacon fires are romantic, not practical. Drums and horns are music, not language. Flags are ceremonial, not urgent. But once they were life itself. They carried words before wires, voices before telephones, networks before the internet. They remind us that human beings have always reached outward, always sought to speak beyond their bodies, always invented ways to make presence stretch across absence. So let us remember them tonight. Imagine a watchman on a medieval tower striking a bell at midnight, its sound rolling through sleeping streets. Imagine a rider on the royal road, cloak snapping in the wind, carrying a sealed message across deserts.
Imagine a fire leaping from hill to hill, neighbors watching in silence, knowing danger was near. Imagine the roll of drums through trees, their rhythm carrying meaning farther than the eye could see. These are not footnotes, but foundations. They are the forgotten voices of history, the first networks, the quiet ancestors of every message we send today.
Civilization is often measured by its monuments, its laws, its wars, and its art. Yet just as important, though rarely celebrated, are the quieter habits of daily life. How people kept themselves clean, how they tended their wounds, how they endured sickness, and how they preserved dignity in a world without modern medicine. Hygiene and health are so natural to us now that we scarcely pause to consider their histories. We expect soap at the sink, water at the tap, medicine in the cabinet, a doctor within reach. But for most of human history, these things were not given. They were inventions, small, fragile, and often forgotten, born of experimentation, trial and error, passed hand to hand across generations until they became invisible. They were not glorious machines or shining discoveries. They were lumps of soap, clay jars of salve, polished bronze mirrors, wooden combs, heated baths. Yet they changed human existence as profoundly as any empire or conquest. Consider the humble soap. Today it is so ordinary that we barely notice it. But in antiquity, to create a substance that could cut through grease, dirt, and sweat was remarkable. Clay tablets from Babylon dating back nearly 3,000 years record recipes for soap-like materials, mixtures of fats and ashes boiled together. Egyptians knew of it, as did Greeks and Romans, though for them bathing itself mattered more than the bar of cleansing. In medieval Europe, soap-making became a craft, with guilds protecting recipes, cities like Castile and Marseille becoming famous for their production. To wash with soap was not merely about hygiene, it was about comfort, freshness, and sometimes status. Yet soap never had a single inventor, a single eureka moment. It crept into life quietly, shaped by countless anonymous hands. And when it succeeded, it was forgotten as invention, remembered only as necessity. Without soap, the spread of disease would have been far worse, daily labor more exhausting, homes less bearable. The quiet revolution of cleanliness began with those crude blocks, curing on wooden shelves, carried in baskets to market stalls. Bathing itself was a technology, not a given. Roman baths are legendary, vast halls of marble and mosaic, heated by hypocaust systems that drew hot air beneath floors, warming pools of varying temperatures. These were feats of engineering, but also of culture. To bathe was social, ritual, and medicinal. After Rome's decline, many of these systems vanished in Europe, though echoes remained in public bathhouses of the Middle Ages and the hammams of the Islamic world, where steam and stone preserved traditions of cleanliness. The hammam itself was an invention of architecture and water management, domed roofs trapping heat, channels guiding steam, attendants wielding scrapers to cleanse the skin. These places were more than buildings. They were technologies of hygiene, combining heat, water, and ritual into an enduring system of care. Forgotten now in the shadow of showers and bathtubs, they once stood at the heart of communal life, places where health was preserved as much as dignity. Simple tools carried immense weight. The comb, carved from bone or wood, kept hair clean and controlled. The toothbrush, first used in China with bristles of boar hair, spread slowly westward, transformed into softer versions centuries later. Even the toothpick, seemingly trivial, mattered in a world without dental care. Herbal rinses made of mint, myrrh, or vinegar served as early mouthwashes, carrying not only practical value, but symbolic freshness. Nail cleaners, tweezers, razors all appeared in antiquity, silent instruments of self-respect. They were not glamorous, but to live without them was to live unkempt, exposed to infection, denied small comforts that we take for granted. Medicine, too, depended on humble instruments.
Long before stethoscopes or scalpels, there were forceps of bronze, probes of wood or bone, scalpels of flint. Physicians in Greece and Rome catalogued hundreds of such tools, each suited to its task, each refined through use and imitation. Many have been recovered from archaeological digs, slender, delicate implements designed with astonishing care. They remind us that the healing arts did not wait for modernity to begin. Even the simple bandage, linen strips wound around wounds, soaked in honey or vinegar to protect against infection, was an invention of extraordinary consequence. To bind a wound properly was the difference between life and death. To apply a poultice of herbs was to harness the chemistry of plants in ways we barely appreciate today. These acts of care were inventions, refined by centuries of trial, transmitted through apprenticeships, quietly saving lives without recognition. Perfume and ointment also belong to this world of health and hygiene. In many cultures, scented oils served not only to please, but to mask odors in crowded cities, to soften skin dried by labor, to soothe aches and fevers. Mortars and pestles ground herbs into powders and salves. Jars preserved concoctions of wax and resin. Lamps heated balms before application. Each step was technological, though we seldom recognize it. The act of rubbing ointment onto a sore limb was the culmination of centuries of invention, chemistry, and craft. Cleanliness, moreover, was not just about the body, but the environment. Sweeping tools, brooms of twigs, cloths for wiping, pails for carrying, these are so ordinary that they rarely enter histories, yet they shaped the texture of life. A swept floor, a washed cloth, a rinsed dish, these small acts preserved health in ways statistics cannot capture. The fight against dirt, disease, and disorder was waged with these forgotten tools, wielded daily, invisibly. What makes all these inventions remarkable is not their complexity, but their persistence. Unlike steam engines or telescopes, they had no single moment of arrival, no great unveiling. They grew slowly, passed from hand to hand, refined by need rather than glory. And when they succeeded, they disappeared into routine. We no longer marvel at soap, or combs, or wells of clean water, but to live without them, even for a day, would be to understand their true value. They were silent revolutions, carried out not in palaces or laboratories, but in kitchens, bathhouses, workshops, and homes. And they shaped societies just as surely as politics or war. A community with access to clean water, soap, and baths thrived, its people healthier, its children stronger. A community without them withered under disease. These inventions determined not only comfort but survival, not only dignity but destiny. To wash was to live longer. To heal a wound was to preserve a worker, a soldier, a parent. To bathe together was to weave social bonds, to reinforce belonging. Hygiene and medicine were not luxuries, they were the foundations of continuity. So tonight, as you think of history, remember not only the monuments of kings or the machines of industry, but also the quiet tools of care. Remember the soap bubbling in wooden tubs, the bathhouse steaming in dawn light, the comb scraping gently through hair, the physician bending over his bronze tools. Remember the ointments, the rinses, the bandages, the brushes. They may seem trivial, but they were the instruments that kept humanity alive, century after century. Forgotten, yes, but never unimportant. Their silence was their power, and their invisibility their triumph. For without them, the grand stories of history would never have been lived long enough to be told.
Travel has always been more than movement. To leave one's home, to set out on a path, to ride through unknown lands or sail across uncertain waters has never been only a matter of distance. It was always a negotiation with danger, with darkness, with hunger, with confusion.
Today, we step into cars guided by glowing dashboards, cross roads lit by electric lamps, navigate by satellites whispering directions through invisible signals. But for most of history, every journey was an ordeal of preparation, made possible only by a long chain of small, forgotten inventions that shaped safety, direction, and endurance. They were not glamorous, they were not praised, yet they carried every traveler, every pilgrim, every merchant from one horizon to the next. And in their quiet way, they changed how people thought of the world itself. The greatest enemy of travel was not always distance, but darkness. When the sun set, roads became treacherous. Paths disappeared into shadows, thieves took their chances, horses stumbled, carts broke. To fight the night, people turned to flame. Lanterns, simple at first, iron frames with horn or glass to shield a candle, became companions of travelers. Carried on poles, hung from carts, fastened to saddles, they cast circles of safety in the void. Entire towns built systems of night watchmen, whose duty was to light torches along main roads, tend fires in braziers, or swing lanterns at crossings. It was not the bright flood of modern lamps, but for a weary traveler, the sight of a faint glow in the distance was reassurance that civilization still waited. These small devices of glass, oil, and wick were inventions of survival. Without them, the night consumed journeys. With them, movement continued past dusk, and trade and life expanded into hours once forbidden. Direction was another enemy. Paths twisted, rivers forked, forests confused. To guide the way, humanity invented markers. Stones piled at crossroads, carved posts showing the distance to towns, painted symbols etched into trees. These were the earliest maps, written upon the landscape itself. In the Roman world, milestones lined roads at regular intervals, carved with the names of emperors, distances to cities, reminders of power as much as guidance. In medieval Europe, crosses or shrines often stood at crossings, both markers of route and places of pause. Later, signboards were hung in towns, painted with symbols of inns or markets, giving weary travelers bearings in a world without printed maps. Even the compass, when it finally spread from China into Europe, was a quiet invention of direction, a simple needle floating on water or pivoting on a pin. But with it, the seas themselves became legible. No single compass saved a life, yet without them, the age of exploration would have been impossible. These were not just tools, they were contracts with the unknown, promises that journeys would not end in confusion. Safety required more than light and direction. Roads themselves were inventions. To pave a path, to lay stones or gravel, to drain ditches and raise embankments, these were technologies of movement, invisible when they worked, miserable when they failed. Roman engineers left their mark in stone roads stretching across Europe, straight and enduring. But long after Rome's fall, villagers still laid simple wooden planks across mud, built causeways through marshes, filled ruts with gravel. Bridges, too, belonged here. Small wooden spans over streams, rope crossings in mountains, each a quiet miracle to the traveler whose journey would otherwise be cut short. The road was not given. It was made, repaired, and maintained by forgotten hands whose work was the true infrastructure of life. Other inventions guarded the body itself. Saddles shaped for long rides, stirrups giving balance, harnesses that spared animals from injury, these were all designed not only for comfort, but for survival. A rider with stirrups could fight, but more importantly, he could travel longer without exhaustion. A cart with a well-designed axle turned more smoothly, saving both beasts and people. Travelers carried water flasks of leather, food wrapped in waxed cloth, cloaks lined against rain, boots studded with hobnails for grip. Each was small, each easily overlooked, yet together they were the difference between arrival and disaster. Signals also played their part in safety. Bells hung at town gates rang to mark closing hours, warning travelers to hurry inside before dark. Watchfires were raised on towers to show the path to ports. Even the simplest horn blast on a road might warn of wagons approaching or dangers ahead. Caravan leaders across deserts devised systems of whistles and flags to keep columns together through dust and distance. These were inventions of communication, improvisations turned into traditions, forgotten now, but once the only protection against chaos. To imagine a journey in those times is to imagine a symphony of forgotten tools. The glow of a lantern swinging with each step, the crunch of gravel under a cart's wheel, the sight of a milestone carved with distant names, the feel of a compass needle cambling toward north, the clatter of a stirrup against iron, the tug of reins on a harness designed to spare an animal's neck, the faint horn of a watchman, the flicker of a torch in a village square. Each was small, yet each was invention, and without them the world would have been narrower, harsher, lonelier. Today, we cross borders and oceans without thought, guided by glowing screens, sheltered by comforts we forget are inventions themselves. But beneath this modern ease lies the memory of lanterns and stones, ropes and compasses, milestones and horns. They remind us that safety, direction, and endurance are not natural, but crafted. They remind us that every road was once an experiment, every journey once an ordeal. Forgotten now, they were once the very threads of civilization, the small inventions that bound towns into nations and strangers into neighbors. So as you drift into rest, imagine the old road. A lone traveler, lantern in hand, cloak wrapped tight, following a faint milestone by moonlight. Ahead, the glimmer of a village torch promises shelter. Behind, the darkness of the forest waits. His safety is not in kings or armies, but in the silent tools of the road. Inventions so small they vanish, yet so great they carried the world itself.
History is usually written through crowns, conquests, and discoveries, but beneath all of these lay the quiet rhythm of labor. The true pulse of civilization has always been work: fields tilled, grain ground, cloth woven, wood shaped, metal forged. And behind every act of labor were tools, machines, and devices so ordinary that we no longer see them as inventions. Yet they were inventions, each born of necessity, each refined by countless hands, each transforming how people lived. Tigid Molnar that turned rivers into power, Toku das Gachlada that gave fabric to the world, hammers and saws and chisels that turned raw materials into life itself. These were the engines of history long before steam or electricity. Forgotten now, hidden in the shadows of modern industry, they once defined the soundscape of every village and town. Imagine first the tegermon, the mill. To grind grain by hand was backbreaking work. Stones rubbed against one another, crushing kernels into flour, but the process consumed hours, leaving shoulders aching, arms numb. To free humanity from this burden, people turned to water and wind. The watermill, simple in concept, profound in effect, harnessed the current of rivers to turn great wheels, gears transferring motion to heavy millstones that ground grain effortlessly. Entire villages gathered their harvests to such places where a day's labor by hand could be done in minutes by flowing water. The invention was not dramatic, no fireworks, no proclamations, but it reshaped society. It freed time, expanded production, and gave rise to surplus. Later, windmills sprouted on plains, their sails catching breezes, turning gears that lifted water, pressed oil, cut timber. The sight of a mill became the symbol of sustenance itself, its turning blades as natural as the sun.
Yet who remembers the first builder? The names are gone, though their wheels once fed thousands. Next, the toku daskachlada, the loom. Clothing is so natural today that we forget it was once one of the greatest challenges of human life. To take fibers, wool from sheep, flax from fields, cotton from plants, and transform them into thread, then weave that thread into fabric, was a task of staggering complexity. For millennia, it was done by hand, women at spindles twisting fibers into yarn, then interlacing strands on simple frames. But the loom, with its clever system of beams, heddles, and shuttles, multiplied human effort. A weaver could create vast sheets of cloth, patterned and strong, with rhythm and speed. In villages, looms clattered in cottages, their sound the heartbeat of domestic life. In towns, guilds of weavers grew wealthy, their fabrics traded across continents. Every piece of clothing, every sail for a ship, every tent for an army was born on these wooden frames. Without them, society would have remained naked to the elements. Yet today, their invention is forgotten, buried under modern industry. The loom stands only as a museum piece, its quiet revolution invisible. And then the ustakhana, the workshop, filled with tools whose names we hardly speak. The hammer, chisel, saw, plane, file, each a simple extension of the hand, yet each a marvel of imagination. To split wood with an axe is one thing, but to shape it with a saw, to smooth it with a plane, to join it with a chisel is another. These tools built houses, carts, ships, furniture. They created comfort and shelter, enabled storage and trade, gave beauty to life as well as utility. Metalwork, too, relied on small instruments, tongs to hold glowing iron, bellows to fan flames, molds to cast shapes, anvils to bear blows. In every clink of hammer, in every hiss of quenched steel, there was invention. The forge was not merely a place of heat, it was a factory before factories, where silent tools amplified human strength. These inventions reshaped not only work, but society itself. The mill created surplus, enabling trade and specialization. The loom clothed populations, supported armies, and decorated palaces. The workshop tools built ships, wagons, bridges, and homes. Together, they allowed civilization to rise beyond subsistence, to build not only for survival, but for culture. And yet, because they were so deeply woven into life, they vanished into invisibility. We remember kings who wore the cloth, not the loom that wove it. We recall generals who marched armies, not the millstones that fed them. We praise cathedrals of stone, not the chisels that shaped every block. The quiet triumph of these inventions is that they became so natural, so necessary, that they ceased to feel like inventions at all. Picture, if you will, the rhythm of a medieval village. At dawn, the wheel of the watermill turns, creaking as grain pours into stone. Flour dust fills the air, coating miller and sacks alike. In cottages, looms clatter, shuttles flying back and forth, threads tightening into fabric. In towns, guilds of weavers grew wealthy, their fabrics traded across continents. Every piece of clothing, every sail for a ship, every tent for an army was born on these wooden frames. Without them, society would have remained naked to the elements. Yet today, their invention is forgotten, buried under modern industry. The loom stands only as a museum piece, its quiet revolution invisible. And then the ustakhana, the workshop, filled with tools whose names we hardly speak. The hammer, chisel, saw, plane, file, each a simple extension of the hand, yet each a marvel of imagination. To split wood with an axe is one thing, but to shape it with a saw, to smooth it with a plane, to join it with a chisel, is another. These tools built houses, carts, ships, furniture. They created comfort and shelter, enabled storage and trade, gave beauty to life as well as utility. Metalwork, too, relied on small instruments, tongs to hold glowing iron, bellows to fan flames, molds to cast shapes, anvils to bear blows. In every clink of hammer, in every hiss of quenched steel, there was invention. The forge was not merely a place of heat, it was a factory before factories, where silent tools amplified human strength. These inventions reshaped not only work, but society itself. The mill created surplus, enabling trade and specialization. The loom clothed populations, supported armies, and decorated palaces. The workshop tools built ships, wagons, bridges, and homes. Together, they allowed civilization to rise beyond subsistence, to build not only for survival, but for culture. And yet, because they were so deeply woven into life, they vanished into invisibility. We remember kings who wore the cloth, not the loom that wove it. We recall generals who marched armies, not the millstones that fed them. We praise cathedrals of stone, not the chisels that shaped every block. The quiet triumph of these inventions is that they became so natural, so necessary, that they ceased to feel like inventions at all. Picture, if you will, the rhythm of a medieval village. At dawn, the wheel of the watermill turns, creaking as grain pours into stone. Flour dust fills the air, coating miller and sacks alike. In cottages, looms clatter, shuttles flying back and forth, threads tightening into fabric. In towns, guilds of weavers grew wealthy, their fabrics traded across continents. Every piece of clothing, every sail for a ship, every tent for an army was born on these wooden frames. Without them, society would have remained naked to the elements. Yet today, their invention is forgotten, buried under modern industry. The loom stands only as a museum piece, its quiet revolution invisible.
History is often told through thunder. We remember the roar of battles, the proclamations of kings, the shouts of revolution. But beneath that noise runs another current, softer and steadier, the current of forgotten inventions. They were not announced with fanfare, not carved into marble, not celebrated with monuments. They were tools, humble and ordinary, a match sparking fire at dawn, a lock clicking shut on a chest, a pair of lenses returning clarity to fading eyes, a quill scratching ink across a page, a lantern swaying on a night road, a millstone turning with the river's current, a bar of soap dissolving in warm water. Each was small, each seemed trivial, and yet each shaped the rhythm of human life more profoundly than crowns or battles. What unites them is their silence. They succeeded so completely that they disappeared into routine. No one marvels at paper when reading a book, or at soap when washing hands, or at a key when locking a door. Yet without these inventions, our world would collapse. They are invisible pillars, carrying the weight of civilization without seeking recognition. Their triumph is precisely that we forget them. Forgotten does not mean failed. Forgotten means indispensable. As we have wandered together through these chapters, we have seen how these inventions not only solved problems, but reshaped thought. They taught us that time could be measured, that privacy could be secured, that knowledge could be preserved, that journeys could be guided, that food could last through winter, that homes could be warmed or cooled, that voices could travel beyond the reach of lungs. They taught us patience, endurance, ingenuity. They stretched the boundaries of survival into the realm of comfort, and the boundaries of comfort into the realm of culture. They carried us quietly forward. And perhaps the lesson they leave us is humility. Progress is not always loud. It is not always the work of geniuses etched into memory. Often it is the anonymous tinkering of craftsmen, the experiments of housewives, the refinements of laborers, repeated and improved until they vanish into habit.
Civilization is not built only by heroes. It is built by soap boilers, millwrights, weavers, smiths, potters, scribes, farmers, and ferrymen, all of whom left behind tools more enduring than their names. Tonight, as you prepare to rest, imagine these silent companions once more: the drip of water in a clepsydra, the hiss of a match in the dark, the creak of a mill wheel, the whisper of a brush through hair, the quiet scratch of ink across parchment. These are the sounds of history's other story, the story of forgotten inventions that never demanded glory but gave us life itself. And as you drift into sleep, let their memory rest with you gently. Let it remind you that progress is not always thunder. Sometimes it is whisper. That greatness is not always visible. Sometimes it is hidden in the ordinary. That history is not only kings and battles, but kitchens, workshops, roads, and wells. In those small places, in those forgotten tools, the world was remade. Good night. May the silence of their triumph carry you into rest as steady and enduring as the inventions themselves.